So one of the things that people who like science fiction really like to do, I can't really exaggerate too much how much science fiction fans like to argue about what science fiction is. I mean, it might seem pretty obvious, right? Everyone knows about science fiction, even people who don't like it, especially people who don't like science fiction. They know what sci-fi is. That's one of the reasons why what science fiction is an interesting argument, because science fiction is everywhere. When I was a kid, science fiction to me seemed hard done by. It seemed like a thing that only a few people liked. It was really hard to find it. You could find it in some books. Actually, at the time, they were really best-selling novels. And then over my 40-something years of life, science fiction has exploded. Science fiction is everywhere. You go to the cinema, it's packed full of science fiction movies by Christopher Nolan or Marvel superhero movies. You play a video game and you're going into Mass Effect and traveling across galaxies and having all of these sci-fi experiences and books and music and animation and role-playing games, and our culture is absolutely fascinated by science fiction. And the people who like science fiction the most like to argue about what science fiction actually is. Whilst, there's billions of people and they say, well, it's stories in space or it's stories in the future. Okay, it's definitely stories. Science fiction. There's a fiction thing going on there. Fictions, we're generally talking about some kind of storytelling with something sciencey going on. But that doesn't seem to explain why billions of us going to darkened cinemas for Marvel superheroes or for Interstellar, why billions of us spend hundreds of hours of a month immersed in sci-fi realities and video games, why we love to read the books. You get the idea. And what science fiction is tells us something about why science fiction is so important to us here in the year 2021 when I'm recording. So what I want to do is go through 3 common fallacies about what science fiction is. And people who enjoy arguing about what science fiction is can have fun arguing about whether these fallacies or not. But I'm placing them there as fallacies, as the common arguments for what science fiction is. And almost without doubt, if people watch this video, they will remake these fallacies in the comments about it. So the reason I'm putting them here first is to give you a reason not to do that, to try and dispel these 3 common fallacies about science fiction before getting onto a specific idea about what science fiction is that's actually useful for explaining why science fiction is so important to us. So what are these 3 fallacies? The first one is that science fiction is entertainment. Now, when I put these fallacies forward, it doesn't mean that it isn't this thing. You can be entertained by science fiction. You can go to the cinema, have a good time. You can chill out with Netflix. That's fine. You are entertained by science fiction. But that doesn't mean that that is what science fiction is. What else can you be entertained by? Think about the number of times that parents have gone out and they bought the new expensive plastic toy for their kids, and it's shiny and glittery and flashing lights and little characters you can play with. And the kid ignores the toy and plays with the box. The box can be entertaining. Sometimes people are entertained by bad things, in our value system. My country, Great Britain, was really into, during the medieval period, bear baiting. Having dogs attack bears and people would cheer, and ancient Romans liked the gladiatorial games. So human beings can be entertained by lots of things. It's a subjective value what we are entertained by. So being entertainment doesn't seem to give us the why of what science fiction is. Many things are entertainment. And it's also, let's be upfront and frank about this, a bit of a degradation of what science fiction is. God bless you. God bless me. I like to leave all of this stuff in my videos. You can probably hear in the background, I live amongst rice fields in Bali. You can hear windmills which are scaring the birds away. You can hear people hoeing the rice. You can hear birds in the background. It's all good. This is reality from where we're talking. It's an interesting thing to think about reality whilst thinking about the fantasy of science fiction. It's a bit of a degradation of science fiction, though, to say it is just entertainment. Imagine, go on a little mind journey with me. Imagine that I asked you what science was, and you said, "Oh, I just like science that entertains me. I look at all the equations. I don't like E equals mc squared. I don't find it entertaining. So I personally cleave to my Newtonian gravity. That's what I like, and I know what I like." Now, clearly, science fiction is not science. It operates quite differently, but it has value. And if we say the only thing it's there for is entertainment, that's a degradation of the possible value. Be entertained by science fiction. Why don't you? The second fallacy about what science fiction is that science fiction is a genre. We have, especially in the world of the printed novel and in films, we have genres, things which are similar to other things. And genres are quite useful. It's quite useful to be able to go to your Blockbuster Video, when there was such a thing, or switch on Netflix today. And so you have the horror genre, you have the fantasy genre, you have the thriller genre. But if you've ever experienced trying to make decisions that way, you find that actually only a few things in the genre are very good. The Bourne movies are particularly good, but then there's loads of copies of them. And this is what we confuse when we talk about science fiction as a genre. Because science fiction is so popular, when something in science fiction is successful, you get loads and loads and loads of copying of it. And this is the commercial appearance of genres. And as a consumer, a genre might have some use to you, but again, it's not a very good way of explaining the what and the why of science fiction. That doesn't mean there isn't a use for genres. Genres can be very useful. Science fiction, if you think of all of the stories that are called science fiction, there's nothing that really connects them all together as a genre. But there are some genres within science fiction. Space opera might be one of them. You can enjoy space opera stories from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series to Anne Leckie's really cool contemporary space operas. And they're in a genre. That doesn't mean they're the same. Let's get away from that idea of a genre. That's a cheap idea. Maybe in romance stories, it's the same story over and over again, so you can just experience the same emotions. But in a healthy genre, you're evolving ideas. And so Isaac Asimov had one set of ideas that he's exploring, and they evolve over to Anne Leckie over here, who changes things like the political meanings. This is a cool use of genre, but it's only a part of storytelling. And if you define science fiction as genre, sometimes the word is used in this kind of proper noun sense, as though genre is a country like Britain or the United States that you can go to. It's a tribal identity. And that's why people cleave to the idea of genre. It connects people into some kind of community around this thing that may or may not be a genre. But again, it's simply a bit of a fallacy. There's genre in science fiction, but it's not exclusively or even predominantly what science fiction is about. Fallacy 1, entertainment. Fallacy 2, genre. Fallacy 3, science fiction is about the extrapolation of scientific discoveries into the future, the speculation on where science might take us. And this is one of the most interesting ways of thinking about science fiction, because we are doing this sometimes with some science fiction. And it can be really cool when Sir Arthur C. Clarke took ideas about carbon nanofibers. He was way ahead of his time. They didn't exist when he was speculating that these super strong fibers, which would be very sharp, and you could accidentally cut all your limbs off and fingers off using them because they're molecular length. But these would be super strong and you could make a space elevator from them. Classic hard science fiction. But the problem with this definition of science fiction is that it leads people, the hard science fiction fan, to exclude so many things that are clearly science fiction. They say, oh, Star Wars, it's not science fiction. It's not got proper science in. Star Trek, oh, most of that's not proper science fiction, hasn't got proper science in. The Marvel movies, not proper science fiction. So this fallacious definition of science fiction to exist has to exclude most things that we think of as science fiction. It doesn't operate. The third fallacy, that science fiction is exclusively the speculation, extrapolation upon science into the future. How did that fallacy arise? Well, really it was a branding exercise when John W. Campbell at Amazing Stories was trying to sell lots of science fiction stories to the public. Before that branding term existed, science was a very popular trend in the public imagination. He blended them into this term, science fiction. And then it's one of those times when the name then defines expectations. So we have these three fallacies about science fiction. What would be a more useful way to think about what science fiction is? I interviewed the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, who's also a big science fiction fan, lifelong. We had a fascinating hour-and-a-half long interview. For my course, Advanced Sci-Fi and Fantasy, Writing the 21st Century Myth. And in our conversation, I pointed out to John just a simple idea that he hadn't thought about before, that in science and fiction is the meeting of two things that in our society today we often think shouldn't be mixed. Science is science, it's facts, it's over here. Fiction is stories, it's made up, it's over here. If they were to come together, it would be very confusing. John Vervaeke, who has wonderful insights into so many subjects because of his learning across cognitive science and psychology and related disciplines, named this. He named this as a symbolon. Science fiction is a symbolon. Symbolon is the Greek term for the joining of two things that don't belong together, that aren't naturally friends with each other. And science fiction is a symbolon. From symbolon we get symbols, and all symbols are about joining things that aren't usually joined, that are cognitively difficult to relate to each other, into symbols that are very powerful expressions of this clash of joinings. In science fiction, we're joining two things that we can also look to classical Greek culture to understand. The Greeks gave us the word logos, from which we take logic today. But the logos was a rather more expansive idea than logic. The logos was talking about all of the ideas, the rational, logical ideas that a society, a culture, humankind generates science and other disciplines within academia and engineering and all of our learning about the world in rational, waking, factual terms. This is the Logos. And for the Greeks, the Logos had something like a life of its own. In fact, Heraclitus, and it talked about the Logos as a spirit that was operating within the culture. Really interesting when you think that where do our ideas come from? They come from this thing that we might call the Logos. Today we might call it the zeitgeist, the spirit of a time, how all of these ideas interact and breed with each other. And the Logos is very powerful in our society today. We are a logic and reason driven society, and we're all engaged in forming the Logos and in forming ourselves from it, because we take our ideas from this cloud. Interesting to call it that. Now we live in the era of the cloud, where all of our data is up on the cloud. That's almost the manifestation of the Greek idea of Logos. But the Greeks also had another word for knowledge, essentially, which was mythos. And the mythos came earlier in Greek society, and it's where we get the Greek myths from. Because whilst the Logos is factual, the mythos is about characters and stories and myths. And it's where we get much of our sense of being a character. This comes from the mythos. We watch stories to understand how humans might behave. When the classical Greeks went to the theatre and they were enjoying Sophocles' tragedies, for instance, they were modelling, and they could learn from the model human behaviour, different kinds of archetypal human types who are all stirred together in the mythos. And the mythos is where the gods existed and where they arose from. The mythos is the place of dreams and imagination. It is non-logos, illogical, irrational in many ways. It is intuitive. It is the sleeping unconscious mind to the waking conscious mind. It is the Dionysian mind, Dionysus, god of drinking and feasting, getting out of your head, to the Apollonian ideas of the Logos. We're a Logos-dominated society, but at some time, and it's grown through my life, so maybe we can date it back 40, 50 years, something like that, the mythos started to return really powerfully into our society. And it returned primarily in the form of science fiction. Because what are the two things meeting in the symbolon of science fiction? They are science and fiction. Science, logic, reason, logos. The logos, the spirit of logical ideas in our society. What is fiction? Storytelling, myth, mythos. The totality of the unconscious dreaming in our society, which is filled with beings, characters, gods, stories. Mythos and logos meeting in the symbolon of science fiction and producing symbols. The symbolon of science fiction generates symbols. Symbols like the space tower of Arthur C. Clarke, like the Matrix, this kind of living computer system that humans are lost in the Matrix, like the monolith of 2001, some kind of alien intelligence advancing human evolution in that symbol, like the Force in Star Wars, some power that connects all living things across the galaxy. The lightsaber from Star Wars. The Enterprise, the Starship Enterprise from Star Trek. could go on. The One Ring from Lord of the Rings. The presence of Big Brother in 1984 and many other potent symbols placed into our culture, symbols that we use to understand the reality that we're living in, the shifts and changes that we're going through. How often do you hear people talk about Big Brother or the evil eye of Sauron, very related symbols, to understand the kind of growing power of the state in our world, but not to understand it purely through logos. We could do that through political theory, or even through mythos, simply through the irrational dreams that are generated by the individual in relation to our world, but the unity, the clash, the joining into a symbolon of the mythos and the logos. This is what the science fiction writer is a specialist in. In a way, every science fiction writer worth their salt is a prophet, contacting the symbolon of science fiction and creating from it new symbols that communicate meanings into our societies, but meanings that can't be... I can't tell you what Big Brother or the Force or the One Ring or the monolith or the lightsaber, I can't just tell you what these symbols mean, because they mean so much more than can be expressed in language. That's why we need them generated from the symbolon of science fiction as symbols into our culture. I think this is a much more interesting way to talk about what science fiction is. Science fiction is the art form where mythos and logos are unified. And that gives us the why. That gives us the why of science fiction, because we have been culture dominated by logos. And that was necessary to do. And now we are waking again to the mythos, to the different parts of our consciousness, the waking and the sleeping, the rational and the intuitive, the logical and the mythic, however you want to define it. Left brain, right brain, system one, system two, different ideas you could talk about from cognitive sciences as well. And we were dominated by the logical waking half. The mythos mind is awaking, and science fiction is helping us unify the two into something new. What might come from being maybe the first culture to have truly unified mythos and logos, to no longer have them in opposition, to have taken the different parts of our consciousness and formed them into some kind of new consciousness. And this is why I talk so much about science fiction. It's why I write science fiction. It's why I'm passionate about science fiction, because I think something super meaningful is coming from science fiction and still to come. This is why I'm teaching advanced sci-fi and fantasy, writing the 21st century myth. My name is Damien Walter. Thank you very much for taking this little walk through ideas about science fiction with me. If you wish to argue, that's cool. I'm not going to be very interested in people saying, no, science fiction is entertainment, or no, science fiction is genre, or no, science fiction is just about exploring scientific principles. It is all these things, but it's also something more, something emergent from there. And I'm going to be fascinated to talk about that emergence with anybody who wants to discuss it. Thank you very much again. Join the course, hit the bell, subscribe to the channel wherever you see this. You can find it on YouTube, you can find it on Odyssey, other places. Thank you very much. Goodbye.